Blood and politics usually kept Kaelin awake, but tonight it was a sliver of cheap iron, a ring, not his, resting on the scarred, soapy finger of the woman scrubbing his floors. The wolf in his chest didn't roar. It stopped breathing. "Take it off," he whispered. "Now." Rain battered the leaded glass of the study, a steady, rhythmic drumming that did nothing to drown out the low throb in Kaelin's skull. Drafts slipped through the mortar of the ancient keep, carrying the scent of wet wool, stale ale from the great hall below, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Winter in the Northern Territories was a damp, miserable affair that sank into the marrow. Kaelin sat at a heavy oak table, tracing the edge of a jagged scar on his forearm, his eyes blindly scanning a ledger of grain stores he had read 3 times already. He wasn't reading, he was listening. Behind him, across the expanse of the room, a coarse bristled brush scraped rhythmically against stone. Rowena. She breathed in shallow, measured intakes through her nose, the air catching slightly on the back of her throat, a lingering remnant of the chest fever that had swept through the servants' quarters last month. Kaelin knew the exact cadence of her breathing. He knew the smell of her, lye soap, crushed thyme, and the heavy, earthen scent of a body pushed to physical exhaustion. There was nothing delicate about her. She wore drab, undyed wool that hung loosely from her narrow shoulders. Her hair, a dull brown, was tied back severely with a scrap of leather. She was a maid. He was the Alpha King. The hierarchy was etched into the very stone they stood upon, sealed by centuries of blood and law. Yet, for the past 6 months, Kaelin's beast had drawn a quiet, suffocating circle around her. It was an ugly, irrational possessiveness. He didn't court her. He didn't speak to her beyond brief, clipped commands regarding his hearth or his clothes. He just existed in the same room, letting the ambient warmth of her presence soothe the ragged, feral edges of his mind. He let himself have this one pathetic indulgence, watching her work in the quiet hours of the night. "The ash is thick tonight, my lord," Rowena said, her voice gravelly from the dust. She coughed, turning her head away from the hearth to muffle the sound against her shoulder. "Leave it then," Kaelin muttered, not looking up from his ledger. "The fire will burn regardless. It chokes the draft." She didn't wait for his permission to continue. The scraping resumed. Kaelin finally lifted his gaze, letting it settle on her hunched form. The firelight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the tapestries. He watched the flex of her spine beneath the rough wool, the way she braced her left hand against the blackened hearthstone for leverage, while her right hand worked the brush. That was when he saw it, a flash of dull, bruised metal. Kaelin blinked, the human part of his brain trying to process the visual anomaly before the wolf did. He leaned forward, the heavy oak chair groaning under his sudden shift in weight. His pupils dilated, adjusting to the dim light, pulling the details into sharp, brutal focus. It was a ring, thick, crudely hammered iron, wrapping around the ring finger of her left hand. It was the sort of band commoners exchanged cheap, heavy, and meant to last a lifetime of hard labor. A ringing sound started in Kaelin's ears, high and thin, like a drawn sword sliding against a whetstone. The scent of the room shifted. He inhaled deeply, bypassing the lye and the ash, diving into the microscopic layers of scent clinging to that small piece of metal. Coal dust, flux, the sweat of a man who worked near open flames. Garrett, the blacksmith in the Lower Bailey. The realization didn't hit Kaelin with a heroic surge of righteous anger. It hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. A cold, suffocating vacuum opened up in his chest. The beast inside him, which he spent every waking hour restraining with politics and duty, slammed against the inside of his ribs. It didn't howl. It went deathly, terrifyingly still. Another man had marked her. Another man had forged a piece of the earth, walked up to her, and claimed the one thing Kaelin had silently, violently guarded in his own mind. Rowena stopped brushing. The sudden silence from Kaelin's side of the room was heavy enough to have a pulse. She sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of soot from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and turned to look at him. "My lord?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Kaelin didn't realize he had stood up until his boots hit the stone floor. He was entirely numb. The ledger slid off the table, hitting the ground with a loud, hollow smack. He stepped around the oak desk. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges blurring into dark gray, leaving only her hand and that crude, ugly piece of iron in sharp relief. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. The sheer heat radiating off his body hit Rowena before he did. She flinched, shrinking back against the soot-stained stones of the hearth. Kaelin stopped inches from her. He looked down. The smell of Garrett's forge was sickeningly thick now. Jealousy tasted like copper and bile on the back of his tongue. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. When he finally spoke, his voice was a hollow, breathless rasp that didn't sound like his own. "Take it off." Rowena froze, her pale eyes wide, reflecting the flickering embers. "What?" "The ring." Kaelin's jaw locked so hard his teeth ground together with an audible click. He stared at her hand, his chest barely moving as he fought to draw air. "Take it off. Now." Confusion gave way to a hardened, defensive edge in Rowena's eyes. She pulled her hands to her chest, curling her fingers inward to hide the iron band. It was a small movement, practical and grounded, but to the predator wearing Kaelin's skin, it was an act of defiance that sent a spike of raw adrenaline straight into his bloodstream. "I will not," she said. Her voice shook, just a fraction, betraying the fear she was desperately trying to swallow. "It is mine. It was given to me. By the smith." Kaelin's words were flat, dead things. He took another half step forward. The toes of his heavy leather boots brushed against the frayed hem of her skirt. He was crowding her, using his massive frame to block out the rest of the room, trapping her between his heat and the residual warmth of the fireplace. "Garrett is a good man," Rowena said, her chin lifting slightly. The scent of her fear, sour and sharp, like crushed unripe apples, was flooding the space, but she refused to look away. "He asked the steward for my contract. We are to be wed before the thaw." "Wednesday." The word drove a rusted spike through Kaelin's temple. His breathing hitched, shallow and erratic. He looked at her face. There was a smudge of black soot across her cheekbone, highlighting the hollows beneath her eyes. She was exhausted. She was thin. She was surviving. Garrett wasn't offering her a grand romance. He was offering her a bed off the drafty floor, extra rations of meat, and a fire that didn't belong to a master. It was a transaction of survival. And Kaelin hated himself for understanding it, even as he wanted to tear the blacksmith limb from limb. "You are not marrying him," Kaelin said. "You do not command my heart, my lord," Rowena snapped back, the exhaustion finally stripping away her subservience. She tried to push past him, placing a scarred, calloused hand on his chest to move him aside. It was a mistake. The moment her palm pressed against his tunic, Kaelin moved. His hand shot out, moving with the terrifying, blurred speed of a wolf snapping its jaws. He didn't grab her wrists that would bruise her, and despite the violent storm in his head, his body refused to hurt her. Instead, his large, rough fingers enveloped her left hand completely, engulfing her smaller hand in a grip that was immovable, yet excruciatingly careful. Rowena gasped, trying to yank her hand back. It was like pulling against solid bedrock. Kaelin lifted her hand slowly, bringing it up between them. His breathing was harsh now, echoing loudly in the quiet study. He stared at the iron ring. Up close it was even uglier. Imperfect hammer marks marred its surface. He ran the pad of his thumb over the cold metal. The contrast was stark, his thumb, calloused from sword hilts and reins, lightly tracing the cheap token of another man's claim. "Your heart?" Kaelin murmured, his voice dropping into a guttural register that made the hair on Rowena's arms stand up. He dragged his gaze from her hand to her eyes. "He doesn't want your heart, Rowena. He wants a warm body in his bed and a woman to mend his soot-stained clothes." "And what do you want?" she fired back, her chest heaving. The sheer proximity to him was suffocating. He smelled of rain, pine, and an overwhelming, predatory musk. "You look right through me, my lord. I am dirt on your floor. I am the shadow that empties your chamber pots." Garrett sees a wife. He sees property. Kaelin's thumb slipped from the ring, tracing the rough, chafed skin of her knuckles. His touch was agonizingly light, entirely at odds with the tension vibrating through his massive frame. "He put iron on you, like a marked mare. It is a promise. It is an insult." Kaelin leaned in. His face was inches from hers now. He could feel the erratic puff of her breath against his lips. The internal contradiction was tearing him apart. He wanted to fall to his knees and bury his face in her neck, begging her not to leave him to the dark. And simultaneously, he wanted to drag her to his bed and prove how ruthlessly he could erase the blacksmith's memory. He settled for neither. He let go of his restraint just enough to let the alpha bleed through. His eyes shifted. The human brown bled out, replaced by a luminous, piercing amber that caught the hearth fire and amplified it. The ambient shadows in the room seemed to stretch and deepen. A low, vibrating hum started in his chest, a sound so deep it didn't register in Rowena's ears, but rattled against her sternum. Rowena stopped fighting him. Her breath caught in her throat. Her pupils blew wide as ancient, instinctual terror overrode her pragmatism. She wasn't looking at the tired king of the northern marches anymore. She was looking into the jaws of the apex predator of the woods. "I will not say it a third time, Rowena," Kaelin whispered. He let his thumb rest deliberately over the iron band, applying just enough pressure for her to feel the metal dig into her skin. "Take the ring off, or I will cut off the finger that bears it and hand it back to him myself." It was a bluff. A desperate, ugly lie, born of a beast, backed into a corner. He couldn't harm her if he tried, but he needed her to believe it. He needed the iron gone. Rowena stared at him, her chest trembling. The amber of his eyes was unblinking. Slowly, painfully, she reached across with her right hand. Her fingers shook as they found the cheap iron ring. With a soft, metallic scrape, she pulled it over her knuckle and let it drop. It hit the stone hearth with a sharp clink, rolling a few inches before settling in the cold ash. The sound echoed in the damp room, final and deafening. Silence flooded back into the room, heavier than the damp winter air. The only sound was the erratic, ragged pull of Kaelin's breathing and the hiss of a wet log spitting sap in the fireplace. The iron ring lay half buried in the gray soot. It looked pathetic now. Stripped of its meaning, it was just a cold piece of metal. Kaelin's amber eyes flickered, the violent gold receding as the wolf retreated behind the ribcage of the man. The predatory hum died in his chest. In its wake, a sickening wave of clarity crashed over him. He stared at her bare, red finger, and the reality of what he had just done, what he had just threatened, settled into his bones like lead. He was the king. He was supposed to be the shield of his people, the rational, immovable law. Instead, he had backed a terrified maid against a wall and threatened her with mutilation over a petty, feral jealousy. Rowena didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She stood pinned against the stones, her chest heaving, staring at the space where his hand had just gripped hers. Slowly, the shock in her pale eyes crystallized into something far sharper. Resentment. "Are you satisfied, my lord?" she whispered. Her voice was brittle, stripped of the deferential warmth she usually kept tucked beneath her servitude. She pressed her bare left hand against her stomach, cradling it as if he had actually drawn blood. "You have proved your strength. You can take a piece of iron from a maid." Kaelin recoiled. The words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any blade he had taken on the battlefield. He stepped back, the sudden distance making the room feel inexplicably colder. "Rowena," he started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, tasting the bitter copper of his own regret. "Do not," she interrupted, pushing herself off the hearthstone. Her knees trembled beneath the coarse wool skirt, but she locked them, refusing to bow. "Do not try to find a noble reason for this. You want me to freeze? You want me to spend the rest of my life scrubbing the blood out of your tapestries while you sit in silence?" Garrett offered me a fire. You offer me nothing but terror." She turned away, bending down toward the wooden bucket of dirty, lie-clouded water. She was going to leave. She was going to pack up her brushes, walk out of his study, and he would never hear the quiet cadence of her breathing in the dark again. Panic, entirely human and violently desperate, seized him. "I offer you nothing because I have nothing to give that isn't soaked in blood," Kaylin said. The words tore out of his throat, harsh and unpolished. Rowena froze, her hand hovering over the bucket handle. "You think I look through you?" Kaylin took a step forward, fighting the urge to close the distance again, forcing his boots to stay planted. "I know that you count the stairs when you carry the linens up from the wash. 32 steps. I know you trade your meat rations to the stable boy for extra candles so you can read those battered chapbooks by the window. I know the chest fever left a rattle in your left lung that worsens when it rains. I know everything." Rowena slowly straightened, turning her head to look at him over her shoulder. Her expression was a messy fracture of confusion and disbelief. "You have been the only warm thing in this rotting keep for 6 months," Kaylin continued, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. He looked down at his own hands, scarred, lethal, built for tearing throats and holding swords. "The wolf, it recognized you before I did. It claimed you in the quiet. But I am a coward, Rowena. I thought if I just kept you near, if I just let you breathe the same air, it would be enough. I didn't want to drag you into the politics, the assassinations, the filth of my world." He looked up, meeting her eyes. The mask of the Alpha King was entirely gone, leaving behind a desperately exhausted man. "Then I saw the iron." He pointed a trembling finger toward the hearth. "I saw that another man looked at you and had the courage to do what I was too afraid to do. He asked for you. He claimed you. And it broke my mind." Rowena turned fully around. The anger in her eyes was warring with a deep, profound shock. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous, grounded gesture that grounded the surreal tension in the room. "You are the king," she said slowly, shaking her head. I am dirt, Kaylin." It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. No titles, no honorifics, just the sharp, 2-syllable word that felt like a match striking against a flint. "You are the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth," he corrected heavily. Kaylin finally crossed the distance, but this time he didn't crowd her. He didn't trap her. He stopped 2 feet away and slowly, deliberately, dropped to his knees on the hard stone floor. The heavy thud of his boots and knees hitting the flagstones echoed through the study. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck, the ultimate submission of an apex predator. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the frayed hem of her skirt. "I am sorry," he breathed into the drafty air. "I am a monster for what I threatened. I do not ask for your forgiveness, but I am begging you, do not go to him." Rowena stood perfectly still. The sheer absurdity of the moment washed over her. The Alpha of the Northern Marches, a man who had broken rebellions and slaughtered rogue packs with his bare hands, was kneeling in the soot of his own hearth, begging a maid not to marry a blacksmith. She looked down at his broad shoulders, at the tension corded in the thick muscles of his neck. The smell of his distress, pine needles, crushed underfoot, damp earth, and bitter ozone, was overwhelming. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt an aching, heavy sorrow. Hesitantly, Rowena reached out. Her hand trembled as she hovered over him. Then she let her fingers rest against the coarse, dark hair at the base of his skull. Kaylin let out a shuddering breath, leaning his heavy head against her stomach, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, and burying his face in the rough wool of her apron. He held onto her like a drowning man, clinging to the hull of a shattered ship. Time lost its rigid shape in the dim, rain-battered study, stretching into a heavy, suspended reality. Kaylin stayed on his knees. His face remained pressed against the rough, undyed wool of Rowena's apron, inhaling the sharp scent of lie and crushed time, as if it were the only clean oxygen left in a world choking on ash. His massive shoulders, usually rigid with the burden of a kingdom and a crown, hitched with silent, ragged exhalations. Rowena's hands hovered in the cold air for a long, fractured second. The sheer absurdity of the situation warred with the frantic beating of her own heart. This was the Alpha of the Northern Marches. A man whose name was whispered to frighten children in the border towns. A warlord who had snapped the spines of rogue wolves and brokered blood treaties without blinking. And here he was, kneeling in the soot of his own hearth, clutching the fabric of a servant's skirt to keep from falling apart completely. Slowly, her fingers curled into the thick, dark hair at the base of his skull. The moment her skin made contact with his scalp, a violent shudder ripped through Kaelin's frame. Rowena began to scratch lightly, moving her calloused fingertips in an instinctual, soothing rhythm. It was a grounding motion. She felt the heavy, vibrating tension corded in his thick neck muscles begin to slowly unravel. The terrifying, predatory aura that had suffocated the room only minutes ago evaporated, leaving nothing but a profoundly exhausted, broken man. This lethal creature belonged to her. The realization didn't come with a triumphant swell of music. It came with a heavy, terrifying drop in her stomach. "Get up," she whispered finally, the sound rasping over the dying hiss of the fire. Kaelin stiffened. For a second, his grip on her waist tightened, a raw refusal to let go of his anchor. But he didn't argue. He slowly unwrapped his arms from her waist, his joints popping quietly in the damp air as he rose to his feet. He towered over her, casting a massive, looming shadow against the tapestries. The feral edge was completely gone from his amber eyes, replaced by a hollow, aching intensity that was almost too painful to look at. Rowena didn't step back. She held her ground, reaching up to press her calloused thumb against the rough, dark stubble lining his jaw. "You are a fool," she said. Her voice lacked any heat, entirely stripped of the deferential tone she had used for the past 6 months. "You are a terrifying, selfish, catastrophic fool." "I know," Kaelin rasped. He turned his face just a fraction, pressing his dry, slightly chapped lips against the scarred center of her palm. The simple, desperate contact sent an electric shockwave up Rowena's arm. His breath was warm, smelling of stale wine and rain. "Garrett wanted a wife to mend his clothes," Rowena continued, letting her hand drop to the center of his chest. Beneath the fine linen of his tunic, she could feel the heavy, frantic thud of his heart. "He offered me a small house near the forge. The air would smell of burning coal and flux, but it would be quiet. It would be safe. You." She trailed off, her throat tightening as she looked around the grand, shadowed study. "What do you want, Kaelin?" she demanded, her voice hardening with the pragmatism of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving on scraps. "Because I will not be your dirty secret. I have seen what happens to the maids who catch a lord's eye. I will not be a mistress tucked away in the damp corners of the servants' quarters, visited in the dead of night until your council forces a high-born political bride into your bed. I will not be discarded when I am no longer convenient. If I am giving up my quiet life, if I am leaving a good man standing at the forge, I need to know exactly what I am stepping into. I will not die for a king's temporary obsession." It was a boundary drawn directly in the soot and ash, a demand for survival. Kaelin reached out, taking her narrow face in both of his massive, lethal hands. His thumbs gently swiped over her cheekbones, smearing the black soot directly into her pale skin. He didn't care about the mess. He didn't care about the dirt. "You are stepping into the light," he promised. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that rattled in his chest, filled with a fierce, terrifying certainty. "Tomorrow, I will call the council. I will rip up the southern treaties. I will look the lords of the marches in the eye and tell them exactly who holds my leash. Let them scream. Let them howl. Let the southern packs threaten war and rebellion. I don't care. I will burn this keep to the bedrock before I let you walk out of it." He leaned down, closing his eyes as he rested his heavy forehead against hers. "You are my mate," he breathed, the word hanging between them, heavy with ancient, irrefutable law that superseded any human politics. "There is no mistress, Rowena. There are no political brides." There is only the queen, or there is nothing at all. Rowena's breath hitched, a ragged sound that caught on the lingering chest fever in her lungs. The sheer magnitude of his promise threatened to crush her, but looking up into his burning amber eyes, she saw the absolute, terrifying truth of it. He wasn't playing a game. He was laying his crown, his kingdom, and his beast at her soot-stained feet. She grabbed the heavy lapels of his tunic, her knuckles turning white, and pulled him down. The kiss was entirely devoid of grace. It was a messy, desperate collision of clicking teeth, bruised lips, and stifled gasps. Kaelin let out a guttural groan, his massive arms wrapping around her ribs as he lifted her clean off the stone floor, as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Rowena gasped into his mouth, tasting salt, stale ash, and the intoxicating flavor of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own terrifying nature. He backed her blindly against the heavy oak table. Thick leather ledgers, brass inkwells, and scattered parchment clattered violently to the stone floor as he set her on the edge of the wood. His rough hands mapped the sharp angles of her body through the coarse wool, frantic and hungry, trying to permanently commit the physical reality of her to his memory. Rowena tangled her hands in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her, grounding the violent storm he had held back for 6 months. For the first time in his long, blood-soaked life, Kaelin wasn't thinking about the heavily guarded borders, the dwindling grain stores, or the endless, suffocating politics of his crown. The entire universe had violently narrowed to the scent of thyme, the taste of salt on her skin, and the fierce, demanding pulse of the woman in his arms. Hours later, the roaring fire had burned down to a pile of softly glowing crimson embers. Rowena sat cross-legged on the edge of the oak table, completely swallowed in the heavy, fur-lined warmth of Kaelin's winter cloak. Kaelin sat in his high-backed chair, having pulled her between his knees. He rested his heavy chin on her stomach, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. The relentless winter rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, profound, and fragile silence echoing through the ancient stone keep. On the floor, near the cold hearth, the cheap, crudely hammered iron ring lay completely abandoned in the gray ash. Tomorrow morning, the keep would wake to absolute chaos. The Elder Council would scream of betrayal, the blacksmith would demand answers, the political foundation of the northern marches would fracture and bleed. But tonight, the Alpha King simply tightened his arms around the sleeping maid, buried his face in the coarse wool of her dress, and finally, for the first time in years, truly slept. If you felt the raw tension of Kaelin and Rowena's messy, undeniable bond, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this tale with fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have dropped the ring or fought the Alpha King? Turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic drama.